Have you ever wondered just how far a major corporation would go for a bigger bottom line? Well, today, we're looking at a time when that question was answered in some of the most horrifying ways imaginable. We're going to dive into a pretty dark history of corporate-funded research that, well, used human beings as literal lab rats. This question, right here, is really the core of what we're exploring. It kind of forces you to look past all the shiny new products and scientific breakthroughs, and instead, look at the unsettling foundation they were sometimes built on. And, as you're about to see, the answer can be pretty disturbing. So, let's start with this concept: evil Experiment Slush Funds. It sounds like something out of a movie, but it was all too real. And this wasn't about a few rogue scientists hiding in a basement. No. We are talking about massive, dedicated budgets from companies you'd recognize, specifically set aside to fund experiments that just blew past every ethical line, all for the sake of profit and data. To see one of these slush funds in action, we're going to start in 1940 Sweden. And believe it or not, this horror story begins with the booming candy industry. Okay, so get this number, 83%. That's the percentage of children in Sweden who had severe tooth decay. It was a full-blown national health crisis. So naturally, people started looking at the candy companies. But the industry just claimed there was no definitive scientific proof that their products were the problem. But how they decided to get that proof is where this story just gets dark. A partnership was formed between the Swedish Medical Board and, you guessed it, the candy industry itself. And instead of looking for volunteers, they went straight to an institution and targeted patients who had absolutely no ability to consent. For years, these people were fed incredible amounts of sugar. They even engineered a special, extra sticky toffee just to make sure it did the maximum amount of damage to their teeth. And here's where you see the real motive behind it all. The experiment worked. It gave them undeniable evidence that sugar was destroying people's teeth. But because the candy industry was footing the bill, they buried the results. For 4 years, they sat on that data to protect their profits, leaving the public completely in the dark and their victims in, I can only imagine, agonizing pain. As horrifying as that story is, it was far from an isolated incident. Now we're going to move from a single study in Sweden to a decades-long systemic program of abuse right here in the United States, all centered on a prison in Philadelphia. Just take a look at this timeline. This wasn't some brief, terrible mistake. We're talking from 1951 all the way to 1974. For over 20 years, this prison became ground zero for what our source material calls a gold rush of human experimentation. Any ethical codes were just thrown out the window as these big pharmaceutical and chemical companies poured money in. The language they used at the time, it's just chilling. This quote right here shows you the absolute dehumanization of the prisoners. They weren't people. They were a resource. They were just acres of skin, like a crop ready to be harvested. So who was paying for all this? Well, these weren't some shady fringe organizations. We're talking about some of the biggest names you can imagine. Johnson & Johnson, Dow Chemical, even the US Army. They were testing everything on these inmates, from mind-altering drugs to chemical agents that would literally burn your skin. And this brings it down to the real human cost. These weren't just data points on a chart. One former inmate, Withers Ponton, he remembered an experiment where doctors literally cut his back open and stuffed it with medical gauze for 10 days just to see what would happen. And what did he get for it? $10. $10 a cut. The physical torture is almost impossible to imagine, but the damage wasn't just skin deep. Our next case shows a deliberate, calculated attempt to actually break a child's mind, all in the name of science. The design of this experiment was just diabolical. A psychologist took 22 orphans and split them into 2 groups. The first group, kids who already had a stutter, were given praise and positive reinforcement. But the second group, these were kids with perfectly normal speech, and they were subjected to relentless psychological abuse. They were told over and over that they were developing a stutter. They were constantly berated and shamed every time they tried to speak. So the experiment completely failed at what it was supposed to do. None of the kids actually developed a stutter. But it succeeded in a much more horrifying way. It broke them. It inflicted permanent psychological damage. These children became anxious, withdrawn, and so terrified to even open their mouths that some of them barely spoke for the rest of their lives. So you've got rotting teeth, scarred skin, and shattered minds. What's the one thing that connects all of these awful stories? It's the justification. It's this twisted belief that all of this suffering was somehow a necessary evil for the greater good. This metaphor really gets to the heart of it. The victims weren't seen as people.
They were seen as nothing more than logs used to keep the fire of progress burning. It just perfectly captures how these powerful institutions viewed human life as fuel, as something completely expendable for their own ambitions.
So what do we take away from all this? Well, first, it's clear the victims were never the powerful. They were always the most vulnerable people in society, the disabled, prisoners, orphans. Second, it's obvious that profit and data were consistently placed above basic human decency. Third, this wasn't the work of a few bad apples. Major, respected institutions were a part of this. And finally, it was all wrapped up in this dangerous excuse of being for the greater good.
And all of this history leaves us with a huge question, one that's just as relevant today as it was back then. As our technology and our ambitions just keep growing, as we push the boundaries of science further and faster, how do we make absolutely sure that our ethics always keep pace?